As you probably know by now, I am a huge Oldhammer fan, which basically means if I see a crusty old Warhammer miniature on eBay from the 80s, 90s, or even the early 2000s, and yes, I do consider that to be Oldhammer now, sorry millennials, then I want nothing more than to snatch it up and give it a new home. And since I've been into Oldhammer for such a long time, I've become used to seeing more dated and questionable sculpts like this, and even this, without thinking twice about painting it. Which is why when Games Workshop announced that they were releasing a new Bretonnian Lord for their Old World range, and then they revealed this guy, I was like, okay, cool, he is a funky looking guy. I like him. But apparently I was in the minority, because as soon as this miniature got revealed and the Warhammer community articles started being shared around and people started seeing this previously unreleased miniature for the first time, y'all were mean. Like, real mean. People were laughing at his face and making comments about his freakily long fingers and his very wide cheekbones and the paint job in general, especially on the little squire. And a lot of people were generally upset that Games Workshop was releasing, in all fairness, fairly dated sculpts as new miniatures in the year of our Bretonnian Lord 2024. But is he really the ugliest miniature Games Workshop currently has for sale? Well, to find out, I went and I bought the miniature, and we are gonna give him a fresh lick of paint to find out for ourselves if it was the studio paint job, the miniature sculpt, or perhaps our own mean-spirited nature, which made this release as controversial as it was. Which way we going? That way. Whoosh. So whilst I clean this miniature up a bit, let's have a chat about who the Bretonnian Lord is and why this miniature was so controversial when he was released, just in case you weren't there. From what we can work out from the Warhammer community article written about this little guy, he was sculpted way back in 2008, which was, I think, 15 years ago now, which is crazy, and he was supposed to be a Games Day exclusive miniature, but he ended up being swapped out last minute by this awesome Chaos Lord done by the same sculptor. Since Warhammer community bafflingly don't credit their own employees with second names in the same way they do their outside content creators and influencers, which sometimes results in really funny articles like this one involving Dan and other Dan, all we know is that the sculptor's name is Martin. Given the date this miniature was sculpted, one could assume that this particular miniature was made pretty early on into Martin's career as a professional sculptor. And given that he was available for an interview with Warhammer community, one could assume that he is still a sculptor at Games Workshop. Games Workshop doesn't, or at least very rarely, credits their sculptors, and they actively discourage their creatives from crediting themselves in places like their own personal social media accounts. So as far as we know, Martin sculpted this one Bretonnian Lord in 2008 and this Chaos Lord in 2009, and that's all you may know him for, when in reality it's more likely that he spent the last 20 years sculpting loads of very modern miniatures like this, and even maybe this, which if they are his, demonstrate a far more updated and modern sculpting skill set. But unfortunately, now people are laughing at Martin's work, his early work, which if it was released in 2008, probably would have fit in with the look of miniatures at the time, and he has zero power to pop online and go, hey guys, I heard you're all excited about my Bretonnian Lord, here are some other miniatures which I've sculpted since then, which you may like even more. And I don't think that's fair. So I just want to say, Martin, whoever you are, if you're watching this, I love your work, and so do lots of other people, even if they don't know it's yours. However, with that being said, let's have a little look at some of the, in my opinion, less desirable aspects of this miniature, which I'm hoping to improve upon in my paint job. Firstly, his hands, and in particular his fingers. They do look a little bit long, and I think that the official paint job emphasizes that a bit too much. The metallics are very shiny, reflective, and yellow toned, which normally wouldn't be a problem at all, but on areas like the face, where you have the yellow toned skin with yellow hair and a bright yellow circlet headband, the readability and contrast in this focal point gets a little bit lost. The color scheme is one of the new ones, I think, for the Bretonnians that they've come up with recently, and I really like it. I think it's super cool. However, that bright white cape is just blowing out the miniature a little bit. It's very bright and almost pure white, which for the product photography, especially when you're showing it on white like they're doing on the website, means that the miniature becomes a little bit lost against the background, and that's no good. And finally, his face. It's hard to pinpoint just what the problem is here. A lot of people are saying it's the size of the eyeballs and generally the prominence of his very wide cheekbones. The eyes are quite small and the cheekbones are very prominent, and I think those two things in combination with each other are just making him look a little bit off. But I'm hoping that with some clever choices and a mix of my extensive knowledge on how to paint old Warhammer, I can make some smart decisions to help fix some of these issues. I grabbed my laptop so I could do a little mock-up on Photoshop, and I decided to go with an overall darker color scheme for the miniature, opting for a dark saturated green and red kind of look, with a darker beigey cream on the inside of the cloak instead of that bright white we had before. Also, before all you old world fans run into the comment section to tell me off, I know that I have committed a huge Bretonnian cardinal sin, because in Bretonnian lore, the color green is reserved only for the Green Knight, which is a neat little tidbit about the setting, but for this video, I'm just gonna go with rule of cool, because I think green looks really nice on him. Even without changing the paint job underneath, I really like the way this color scheme is looking, so it's time for me to put my money where my mouth is to see if I can make this guy look as cool as I think he is. Now for me, a lot of Oldhammer painting is about covering up some of the more dubiously sculpted areas of a miniature, and remember, you don't have to paint everything. This guy, for example, has some very, very long fingers, and that's something a lot of people pointed out when he was posted as being an issue with the miniature. So my fix for that was to just not paint most of the fingers. His fingers wrap pretty much all the way around the gloves and the hilt of the sword, so instead of painting the entire length of each finger, I just used some black paint to hide the ends and to shorten them down to a more reasonable human looking length. You'd be surprised how much of a 3D miniature you can hide just using some black paint like this, especially if your paint is nice and matte and non-reflective. On a similar vein, the original paint job for this miniature has some quite veiny hands, which, since the highlights on the knuckles and the sinewy bits are connected to the long fingers, it kind of elongates the fingers even further. So I decided to kind of flatten this veiny ridge detail with some lighter paints, and I also decided to make the gaps in between the fingers thinner and less black, which gives the illusion that the fingers are wider, thicker, and closer together. I think all these things I did in combination with each other really helped to fix some of the issues with the hands, and they look way better already. Like I said, I think one of the issues that this miniature has involving the original paint job was the very shiny metallics, which aren't a problem when you're looking at them under normal lights, but when you put them under full-blown studio lights for product photography, they end up reflecting a lot of light back at you, and I think they ended up making things look a little bit messy and undefined on the miniature. And I think that ended up giving a lack of definition to the miniature, especially around the face and some other areas. I know a lot of people don't like non-metallic metallics, and I'm not the best at painting them either, but at least I know when I shine a light on them, they're not gonna reflect back a ton of white in the final product photograph. And I feel like if I use them, I'm gonna have more control over the contrast and finish of the whole piece. And given that there are a lot of metallic elements on this mini, I think that can only be a good thing. And I can use them to really punch out all those metallic elements out from the rest of the miniature with some stark but not reflective shadows and highlights. And again, I think this was a good idea, and it looks really great on this miniature, especially this little fleur-de-lis on his sword. I'm really proud of that. I think it looks really good, but we will see when it comes down to the final photograph if this choice really paid off. Now it's time to paint the thing I was most nervous for painting, and the biggest issue people seem to have with this miniature, and that is his face. To start with, I decided to make the skin tone more pink to contrast against the yellow in the gold and the yellowy green tones I chose for the rest of his color scheme. I gave him dark brown hair so that I could use the darker colors to create a darker line around his face, giving the illusion that his face is narrower. I also chose not to do as many edge highlights as there are in the original paint job. The original paint job places a very light edge highlight on the bottom of his cheeks, which, whilst taking a lot of skill to do at this scale, I think it just drags his face down and outwards and emphasizes the large bone structure of the sculpt a little bit too much. Putting some gentle highlights on the top of his cheeks pulls the focal point more towards the center of the face and not the outside, whilst also keeping the outside darker and narrowing the face down even more, like when people use makeup to contour their face. When it came to doing the eyes, I decided to make them a bit bigger and more pronounced to make the top half of his face, including his cheekbones, look a bit smaller. I didn't massively overpaint the eyes, but I definitely overlined them a little bit and made the pupil and the eye bag underneath the eye bigger to fill up the space even more. I also gave him this surly side eye expression, which I think suits him really well, and this is a good tip for anyone who struggles with eyes in general, like I do, because it stops you from potentially making him look cross-eyed by trying to make him look forward, but you accidentally do slightly different angles. I think all these methods mixed together with the fact that I used a more pink skin tone instead of a yellowier skin tone, which could have blended in with all the metallics and the hair, really helped to make this miniature look a bit more defined, less goofy, and much more palatable. With all the big problem areas done, it was time for me to finish off the miniature, do some last minute details, and pop him on a base. And I know I haven't painted the squire in this video, and I'm sorry if you were looking forward to me trying to fix the squire, but just, I don't think so. I don't think so, not today. Oh please, me lord, won't you paint me? I've been ever so good, I've been waiting to be painted since 2008. No, I'm sorry, no. After I got him based up on a nice grassy looking field, which I think suits him really well, it was time for me to take him to the photography booth to take some pictures and finally see if I managed to improve on the perceived issues which I noticed with the studio paint job. And maybe surprisingly, but also maybe not surprisingly, I think I've been thoroughly humbled. And here he is, my finished Bretonnian Lord with great weapon. My original plan for this video was gonna be to get the miniature, paint it up and go, see, if you just paint him like this, then he isn't so bad. And I think that might have been quite cocky of me, because now that I've got my miniature photograph and the studio's miniature photograph and I can compare them side by side, I do not think that I am a better painter or achieved a better paint job than the person who painted it for the studio. I think my paint job might actually be worse or less good in a different kind of way. Let me try and explain. Let me show you why. Although, like I said, there are some readability issues with things like the white cloak and the shiny metallics in the studio paint job, that is often something that Games Workshop will enforce. Things like color schemes and using true metallics are something you don't really get a choice about if you're a studio painter at Games Workshop, in the same way you would if you were painting this miniature for fun or for yourself. Often the studio will discourage painters from using things like non-metallic metallics because A, it's not very beginner friendly, and B, if we're being honest, it doesn't really sell Games Workshop's range of metallic paints very well. So I think it's quite fair to forgive things like this super shiny reflectiveness and that bright white cloak, which does make the miniature look a little bit blown out. But take a look at the edge highlights on the cloak cloak details here, and even these purity seals on the sword. These look way finer than I could ever paint, and they kind of make my paint job look a bit like mushy Play-Doh. And having a look at the face from a different angle shows that the eyes are a bit less goofy than the main photography angle depicts them as. I decided, because I am weird and obsessive, that I would finish off the project by taking a picture of my miniature at exactly the same angle as the one on the packaging, so I could superimpose mine onto the packaging to see if I had truly succeeded in improving the paint job. Get a life. Get a hobby. But when I put my miniature next to the professionally painted studio miniature, I don't know if I succeeded or not. I really don't. So let me know in the comments section which one you prefer and why, and just what you think in general, because I found this whole process super interesting. Either way, good or bad, cool or ugly, and even is this miniature from 2008 really worth £15, are all completely subjective things that everyone's gonna have a different opinion about, and all those opinions are totally valid. But I'm really happy with the miniature I painted, and I definitely learned a lot from painting him, and I hope that whoever sculpted him back in 2008 is proud of themselves, because I'm really pleased to have him in my collection. But for now, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. As usual, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for being rogues. I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Bye bye!